Hey friends, welcome to Shigaraki. So today we are going to see, what if Deku was raised by the gods of Olympus? So before we start, check out my Patreon page for 18+ exclusive mature content. We will now proceed to the video. Rain was always a welcome distraction for the young god. The frigid downpour would always push many away, similar to him in ways. More than one, but there would always be those rare few that sought it out. Those that drenched themselves in the icy water and felt the wind whistling past their face as they sat shivering in the chilled air. Reveling in the anonymity it offered. They sat alone in the rain, letting the gentle brush of nature's hand conceal the tears tracking down their face. They were always hoping that no one would notice, but he would. He would always. It was on a dreary Friday morning that he felt such a presence, sitting alone at a filthy beach, heedless of the growing storm. The emotions broiling through him would have been more than enough to catch the god's attention, but the young god had had an eye on this child for many years. The intense desires and wishes in his mind had marked the child as one of his years ago. When the child's need to help was only just sprouting yet still as bright as any other. Like a star bursting to life, this child's dreams were a rarely seen phenomenon in their world. Yet, as the young god examined the child closer, he could feel those very same dreams begin to splutter out and die. He can barely believe his senses, recoiling in shock. Well, he simply cannot allow that. Standing and sighing, the young god forces himself away from his memories with a heavy heart. Like the young child, he too had been sitting alone at the edge of a different ocean. Reflecting as he stared out over the tranquil waters, thinking back on his earliest years. On all the mistakes he had made, all the people he had pushed away, all the lives he'd changed. Time can dull even a god's memory, chipping away at it without ever tiring or slowing. But this young god does not know if he wants to forget. There is so much good that he has done, and just as much bad. Should he forget, and let his pain dissolve into nothingness? Should he let his memories fade, let those shadows that followed him finally die? He does not know, and so, he remembers instead. To that end, the young god rarely left the place that he once called home. He wandered the beaches of New York on his lonesome, keeping to familiar cabins and unfamiliar ruins. Every step was a memory of a life he'd thrown aside, a reminder of friends now buried. He did not want to leave, and besides, he rarely left. But he would leave it now. He would leave this place of bittersweet memories, depart from his now silent house of lost and broken children. Because, somewhere across the globe, there was a young hero who desperately needed his assistance. And not just any hero, his little star themselves. He young god already knew this young child would grow into a hero beyond any in living memory. That was simply fact. As death was Thanatos' domain, heroes were his. Deep down, he knew this child was going to be someone great. So, why were his dreams shattering as he cried alone at a dirty beach? The young god intended to find out. Moments later, he found himself standing at the edge of Dagoba Beach. When his physical form had constructed himself, the young god stared at the beach and blinked in simple and disgusted surprise. Logically, he had known that Dagoba Beach was a trash dump, but after more than 300 years of life, the enormity of mortals' lack of compassion still made him feel small in comparison. Anger rose up in him, at the fact that mortals would treat a beach like this. But he squashed it down as he searched for the young child. He was not hard to find, not at all. The child shone like the sun, almost blinding the young god. Veritable fountains of heroic instinct and selflessness pouring off of him. Even as his willpower crumbled and his vision of the future became muddier, the young boy's heroic nature was no less bright. Nothing could ever hope to mute it. Alone, the child was seated on a broken bench at the base of one of the larger trash heaps. Seeing him made the young god still for a minuscule second. How young was he, to be dreaming of such things? Everyone wants to be a hero these days, far be it from him to end a child's dreams, but the boy was only 11 at most. The thought strikes the young god like a bolt of lightning. Had he only been 12 when he learnt what the real world was like? He had been 12 when any dreams of being a real hero left him, when the facts of life became clear to him, but how could this child know what reality was like? But, far be it from him to end a dream. He has failed too many to fail another. The child is young, but he is in no way free of the injustices of the world. He looks disheveled, his yellowish shirt crumpled, burnt, and covered in a thin layer of dirt. His cheeks still sport baby fat and are covered with freckles and dirt alike, but much more noticeable are the tear marks jutting across them. The child's green locks are pressed down against his face by the wind and rain, and the eye bags under his shut eyes speak of long hours without sleep. What happened, the young god wondered, that pushed the child here? To sit in a storm at the edge of the world. He debated, simply searching through his memories, but it had been a year or two since he'd spoken to a mortal. He'll figure this one out on his own. He had a lot of questions, after all. Why is he here? Alone, alongside the trash? Why are his dreams spluttering out? What is going on? He walked forward, stepping dly in rippling puddles to alert the child of his presence. It worked. The child looked up in alarm, and his emerald eyes, so similar and yet so different to the gods, still so full of life, widened in surprise and shock. Shadowed by his viridian curls, he stared at the young god in vibrant surprise. The young god gave him a rare smile. He didn't smile much these years, but he maintained that children deserve to grow up in a happier world than what they are given. He'll do whatever it takes to make it that way. With a careful hand, he expanded his presence to give off a soft and comforting aura as he neared the child. The child, so full of dreams and hopes and wishes, so full of desire for a thing he for some reason thinks he cannot have, was still seated on the bench. He didn't seem to be moving any time soon. So the young god perched on its edge. He sat in silence for a long moment while the child stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Thunder crackled in the distance. Uncle disapproved whenever he blessed a mortal. But the young god of heroes cannot find it in himself to care. Ever since the flame of the gods migrated to Japan and the second age of heroes came to be, there isn't much the other gods could do to touch him, let alone harm him. This beach used to be such a beautiful place. His voice cracked from disuse, but the nostalgia in it is implacable. It had been many years since he came to Dagoba. Yet he still remembers meeting with his father here once, the soft sand between his toes, the gentle sea breeze ruffling his hair. But now it's nothing but a trash heap. Tell me, kid, if such an amazing place can turn to this, what's stopping something else from growing into something greater? The child kept his eyes on him, but within them shock, confusion and something akin to hope flickered. He's not in the habit of letting kids have the answer immediately, a lesson in teaching he took from his mentor, so he'll let the kid figure it out on his own. Slowly, he began to speak. His voice still raw from the barely concealed crying. Well, nothing, apart from whoever's working on it, their dedication and talent. I guess. So hesitant, so scared of being rejected. His voice is soft and quiet, the voice of one who's learned to keep themselves out of sight and out of mind. The young god nods, deep in thought. Honestly, he wouldn't have expected such a response from himself at 11. But he should have expected it from this one. The child shines brightly in his domain, brighter than all of the others. His spirit's shine rivals that of powerful Toshinori, that of efficient Shota. A vigilant Chizome. Even though he is still years away from even applying to become a hero, the child is a miniature supernova in his peripherals, expanding impossibly fast. And yet, he still found his little star here, sitting alone at the edge of the ocean. He laments something, hoping like all the rest that the rainfall will be able to hide their tears. The rain does a good job of it. But it shouldn't have to. The two sit in silence for a few more seconds, each observing the other. The young god resisted the urge to wipe away the child's tears and telephone. Tell him that everything would eventually be alright. What's your name, kid? You'll catch a cold out here, alone, he probed, waving a hand and absent-mindedly directing the rain away from the pair. He swore that the child's eyes brightened up at that as he immediately launched into a barrage of questions, a hydrokinetic quirk. Or hydrophilic, maybe. I don't think any hydrokinesis quirk could redirect rain, it's too small and numerous. Or at least that's what my mom said when I asked her if she could and if drops of water counted as small. Oh, I'm so sorry, he cut himself off, looking legitimately scared. My name is M. Midoriya Izuku, it's nice to meet you. He stuttered out, looking almost like he was expecting to be shouted at. The young god learned early on, before he even became a god. That undirected anger was never helpful. Still, he cannot stop it from rising in him for just a moment, before he smashes it down. Children. are far too perceptive. It wouldn't do for the little one to think that he's angry at him. After all, he knows too well the fear of authority, all-consuming. Childhood is not something he would ever want to relive, especially his own. Unless he could make different choices. He knows what he would do. What he would change. Looking back up at the dark, stormy sky, with lightning flashing intermittently despite the sun valiantly trying to shine through. He decided that he should probably get the kid to a cleaner spot before he actually caught something. And he can't say he wasn't curious to learn more about this one. After all, he's had his eyes on him ever since he appeared in his domain. As a sheer need to help others overshadowed everything else in his vision like a star exploding into being, the god of heroes had been made aware of this one since his very birth. But, at the very least, this god tried to respect mortals' privacy. After all, it wasn't uncommon for someone to want to become a hero, not in these times. But to wish and hope as hard as this Izuku had is. Well then, Izuku-kun, I'm sure you don't want to get sick, right? Let's get you somewhere clean. And I'll answer any questions about my quirk that you want to ask, so there's no need to look so down. Chin up. Mentally, the young god swore when he added that sentence. Quirks. How could something be so beneficial and annoying at the same time? Even the gods didn't know exactly no caused it. Although Hecate had hypothesized that the godly power in mortals' blood had diluted enough for them to access magic on their own. Whatever the reason those powers developed, it had immensely helped demigods and gods explain their divine abilities. Still, making up believable limits to a limitless power was always slightly frustrating. Yet as he sees the kid's face perk up at that, he can't really bring himself to regret it. Gently, he pulled the child off the bench and led him to the edge of the beach, the two sharing a companionable silence as they picked across shards of broken glass and sharp bits of metal, a very important task for the child, and a way to pretend he was still mortal for the god. The moment they'd climbed up the stairs to the mainland, the god turned around and asked, "So, which way is your house?" He didn't miss how his face fell instantaneously and how his eyes began to fill with tears, as he instead mumbled, "Can we talk about quirks first?" Slowly, he bent down and looked the kid in the eyes, young and bright emerald staring into deep sea green eyes older than the city itself. "Kid, why don't you want to go home?" he asked, his voice as soft as the rain splashing around them, but not inquisitive, not firm. He'd like to say he's good with children, but like everything else in his life, it had come at a cost. Watching as his friends' children grew up, then mourning his friends with their children, watching as their children grow up, mourning them with their children, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Izuku looks away, ashamed. Before he muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, "Dad." Again, the anger rose in him, but this time it was more personal, ugly memories rearing to the forefront of his mind, the sound of bottles breaking. Hiding bruises mottled purple and blue from his mother, cigarette smoke choking him every day, the stench of alcohol following him everywhere he walked. He shook his head, dispelling the thoughts. He hadn't thought about that man in decades and he certainly wouldn't begin now, but he can't help but feel a little bit closer to the child. "Well, in that case, you must be feeling a bit hungry, right? Why don't we get some food in you, There's a nice ramen place nearby, and I'd rather you not stay in the rain and get sick. And we can talk about quirks, I suppose." He began walking again, his heels clicking against the pavement as he gestured for Izuku to follow him, expanding his aura to be even more comfortable and inviting. After a moment, the child ran to catch up. He seemed to have regained some of the light in his eyes. The young god was glad. His hands fidgeting excitedly, he asked, "What's your quirk, sir?" "I thought it was hydrokinesis, but most hydrokinet. I see quirks require a lot of concentration, and wouldn't work on individual droplets, considering their size and number. And I didn't see you attracting any water, only repelling it, so is it a sort of hydrophilic quirk?" His voice was still soft, but the curiosity and intelligence in it is obvious. For just a moment, he was reminded of golden curls and wise gray eyes before he pushed that memory away. His eyes melancholy but voice calm. He responded, "Well, you would be correct in assuming hydrokinesis. I've been blessed with a very powerful hydrokinetic quirk. What about you, kiddo?" His lips curl when he calls himself blessed. If anything, his powers were a curse. Stuck in his self-loathing thoughts as he was, he barely noticed as the child stopped walking suddenly. I don't have a quirk, sir," he says, voice soft. The young god understood better, now. Izuku looked away, choosing to stare across the street instead of at the god. "I understand, sir. I'll be, heading home now. So used to rejection that he'll do it himself and save others the trouble." The young god shook his head in muted disbelief, but Izuku's actions, his thoughts, his dying dreams made a little more sense now. He cursed himself silently. He should have been here and helped this one much earlier. Of course mortals would hate him for not having powers when only a century ago they hated those with powers. He's not going to let this child's dreams die to a setback as small as this, even if he has to train him himself. What does not having a quirk do with anything? "Get back here, kid. We're still getting you some ramen," he said. His voice hopefully calm and not betraying the rage building inside him at the people who have failed this child. He hoped indifference would be a better choice than showing pity or shock. The child turned, his face carefully painted in a neutral expression. The god can still see the slight disbelief underneath it. Slowly, like approaching an easily startled cat, the child stepped back to him. His shock only increased as the god began walking again, strolling across the pavement happily. The pair continued on their way quietly, and they reached the store the God had spoken of before either of them had spoken another word. "What's your name, sir?" the child asked suddenly, his eyes sharp and almost distrustful. Good. He was wondering how long the godly aura would distract the child from realizing he was talking to and following a stranger. The god supposed that maintaining the aura was a bit distracting, but he couldn't believe he hadn't given the kid a name. He hummed quietly, thinking on which alias to use. "You can call me Percy," he said finally, the long-forgotten nickname ringing in the wind. It washed through the empty city alongside the rain, resonating deep in both of their hearts. It was a signal of a new era for both the young god and the young hero. The restaurant was quaint and cozy, the cool orange glow of the lights washing over the pair as they entered. Percy led him to a small corner stall after ordering 2 bowls of ramen, one hesitant palm on his shoulders. It was warm. Not like Dad's, not at all. Izuku slipped in next to the window, glad to still be close to the soft pitter-patter of the rain. Curiously, it was creating a symphony with the soft jazz music playing in the cafe. Izuku had always loved the rain, it was comforting yet cold. Sudden yet unyielding, and whenever it graced Musudafu he always made time to sit and reflect in the rain for some time. This time, though, he wasn't sitting in the rain out of any love for it. This time, he just wanted a quiet place to cry in. But then, Percy had appeared. The man reminded him of the rain, almost. Sudden and comfortable, in its own unique way. But then he had spoken to him. And hadn't left even after learning Izuku was quirkless, and he still bought him food for his grumbling stomach, and Izuku was left wondering when exactly Percy would disappear, just like the rain would. It had to happen, didn't it? No one would stay, after all. Not for him. Izuku took a moment to study the man as he stared out the window, seemingly lost in thought. He was tall and slim, looked to be muscular, and was very obviously foreign. Even so, he spoke Japanese without a problem even if he did throw some English idioms in. His hair was long and wavy, tied up in a strange ponytail at the base of his nape. He had an earring hanging from his left ear, a silver depiction of an owl holding what looked like a trident. As for his dress, he was wearing a crumpled white dress. Shirt under an expensive-looking loose jacket that looked like it couldn't decide between black and blue. His loose pants matched the jacket, and a pair of soft and dark gloves with deep blue palms covered his hands. He was the epitome of rich and careless, at least until Izuku looked at his eyes. They were swirling with color, every shade of green mixing with every other to create a mesmerizing effect. And they were so old. Strangely ethereal and divine. It didn't take more than a glance for Izuku to know that the man had seen things Izuku couldn't hope to imagine. Izuku couldn't put a single word to his eyes. Probably not even a whole paragraph, but if he had to, he would say that they seemed regretful and mourning beyond belief. They told stories in their unfathomable depths. You didn't need to look him in the eyes for long to know that he was kind, that he was humble, that he was powerful. The man's face reminded Izuku of a statue, sculpted by a master. It seemed that his default expression was nostalgic. As he kept a gloved hand on his chin, running it through his salt and pepper beard as he stared out the window, his eyes swirling like miniature whirlpools. Every sin. Glay sign spoke of a man who wouldn't have looked at Izuku twice. But he did. Izuku wanted to know why. After a few moments, the food arrived. Izuku wolfed his bowl down. He hadn't even realized how hungry he was after Dad kicked him out. Izuku wondered whether he should tell Percy. After all, he hadn't left yet. He might be willing to help, or would that be too much? After all, he already knew that he was quirkless. But while he didn't seem to care, Izuku has met people like that in the past. They cared as much as the others, but just hid it better. Besides, it's only been 2 days. And Izuku's still got a bit of money, and it's not like he wants to go back to him. To burns and bruises. He'll be fine, even if Percy doesn't help, right? It didn't matter in the end because Izuku didn't have to ask. Once his food was done and safely down his gullet, Percy turned to Izuku. His face held the slightest bit of anger, hidden in the tightening of the skin around his eyes, and Izuku stilled when he noticed it. Percy saw him flinch obviously, because he gave him a small soft smile, and asked out of the blue, "Are you safe at home?" Izuku ended up gaping like a fish for a few moments as he thought on how to answer. In the end, he settled for a simple, "I don't have a home," although he stated it more like a question. Percy's hand clenched into a fist. "Let me guess, your F.A. Thayer kicked you out because you're quirkless. Where's your mother, kiddo?" Izuku wondered how he knew it was his father, and why he spat out the word with such animosity. And as for his mother, Izuku doesn't really want to talk about that. But he finds himself speaking anyway, desperate for someone to understand. "Mom died a few months back, so Dad had to take care of me, but he didn't want to," he said. Tears already pouring out. Percy handed him a tissue wordlessly, and whispered a few choice curse words under his breath that Izuku didn't think he should be listening to. Percy still remembered what he felt like when Mom died. Shouting and screaming at Hades in his throne room to no avail. His uncle only watched him impassively, a glimmer of sorrow in his cold eyes. When that didn't work, all of a sudden massive storms were ripping apart the world for days until Talia forced him to calm down, bless her. No matter how many he lost, it hurt the same every time. All the other gods say it gets easier. Does he want it too? Any relatives, kiddo? Anyone who'd take you in? He inquired, having calmed himself down just a bit. No, I guess Auntie Mitsuki, but I don't want T to go live there. Izuku said, rubbing his eyes dry and hiccuping. Percy supposes that he has his reasons for not wanting to live there. But he really needs someone to watch over the kid while he deals with the father. And he isn't in the mood to ask any of his own relatives or the mortal authorities. He could look around for a demigod and ask for a favor, after all, they've got much more numerous after the dawn of quirks, but that's easier said than done. Maybe he could call Talia. No, she's in Argentina at the moment. The Ainheri are not exactly safe to leave a mortal with them, in his opinion. Would you be okay staying with your auntie just for a few hours? I need to go and have a chat with your dad. Izuku's eyes widened to saucers. No, please, Dad's dangerous. He all but shouted out, remembering at the last second they were in a restaurant. Thankfully, it was mostly empty, apart from the cashier who looked like he really wanted to call CPS. Trust me, kid, I'll be fine. Percy had to stop himself from laughing out loud, but he was strangely glad that the kid had an eye out for him. How about we drop you off at your auntie's first, yeah? She won't hurt you, right? Plans were slowly forming in Percy's mind, puzzle pieces fitting together. It had been centuries, and he finally has an idea of what to do, where to go, who to do it with. And all he had to do was speak to his little star. Whether it makes him want to cry, or laugh, he can't really say. Percy would pay to see Zeus' face when he realizes that Percy's adopting a mortal child. The next solstice will be interesting, to say the least. It's not like they could stop him, anyways. And they should know better than to hurt the kid. After all, harming the adoptive son of the god of righteous rage. Not a smart idea. Percy can't truthfully say he's doing this just out of the goodness of his heart. The kid reminds him painfully of old memories, of himself, of Nico, of Jason, of Hazel. Of someone who just wanted to help. Others, no matter what anyone else said. Damn it if he won't help the kid. Someone had to. For once, Percy would be that someone. This kid needed love, needed a home, needed someone to believe in him. His little star needed to be given the chance to grow, and Percy, well, Percy would do his best. I guess I'd be fine with staying at Auntie's, Izuku said meekly, phrasing it more like a question. Perfect, then. I've got a car. Think you can direct me to her house? Percy said, gesturing out the door at a parked blue sedan that was definitely not there 10 seconds ago. Thankfully, Izuku didn't seem to question it. Percy had tried to draw Izuku into conversation about this, Bakugo Mitsuki, along the drive, but it had been short and clipped. All he glay. And that Mitsuki was good friends with his mother, but Izuku wasn't good friends with her son, a boy he called Kachan. She was married to a man named Masaru, who Izuku liked more than Mitsuki. So, not much in the way of information. But Percy had fought wars on less. He'd be fine. Thankfully, her house wasn't all that far away. They reached the Bakugo villa after a short 15-minute drive. The house itself was nice. And it was definitely giving Percy ideas for his own house. After all, he can't exactly keep a kid in Olympus, can he? They're gonna need a house to call their own. The Bakugos had a nice 2-story house. Nothing too preposterous or out there. The entire street is made up of modern architecture buildings like theirs. Anna, she would have liked them. He admired it quietly instead, ignoring his mind bringing up things and people he'd rather not hear of. The sky was clear of clouds. Percy had dismissed the storm on the drive here. Percy decided that he'd have to talk to Chiron about the adoption. Now he could bring Izuku into the Japanese camp Half-Blood, but he doesn't think Izuku would do well in a community of demigods. Still, Chiron would be able to give Percy good advice on taking care of kids. And he hasn't seen his mentor in a few decades. Actually, Percy hasn't spoken to any immortals in a long time. The last time was, well, it was Uncle Hades, almost 14 years ago. Time flies, he supposed. He rapped on the door curtly, one hand on Izuku's trembling shoulder. He sighed to himself. It's not that he doesn't trust the kid, but he had to confer. This place was safe for him before he left to meet with his father. As he raised his hand to knock again, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman, her face set in a scowl. But when her crimson eyes fell on Izuku, it melted away to reveal a large, happy smile. Izuku, she shouted. Where have you been, kiddo? Come on in. An admirable but easy to see through effort to distract the kid of his mother's death. Considering her forced smile and tight eyes. In any case, there were more important things for him to be doing. Grimacing to himself, he took a quick swipe through her memories. Yeah, she's good enough to Izuku. If a bit loud and boisterous. Her son wasn't the best, though. Percy might have to give him a talk, or just move away with Izuku, but something will definitely have to be done about that brat. Ahem. He'll be safe with you, I hope. I need to speak with his father, Percy said, putting up air quotes and smiling genially. The blonde looked him up and down, before asking, and who the hell are you? With a faint sneer on her face. Just a friend. I need to speak to Izuku's father. Could you do us a favor and keep him safe till then? Yeah. He asks, eyes pleading with her. So you're one of Hisashi's friends? She asked, her voice dripping with venom. Hardly, he responded, bemused. He pulled out his wallet and slipped her a card. I actually work with CPS. Benefits of being a god. Number 1. Able to pull out necessary documentation with a flick of the hand. Hell, he won't even have to go through the adoption process at all. He could just pull out magical documentation that says Izuku's under his guardianship. But still, legalities. Schools require a legal guardian. There might be a fuss if someone notices Izuku's technically missing if he was living with Percy, etc. While Percy might be a god, he has no clue on how to tamper with legal records safely. He supposed he'd have to go through that whole process. Shaking his head, he brought his focus back onto the pair. Izuku looked like the card in Mitsuki's hands was the answer to all of his questions, while Mitsuki seemed a tad more trusting. As he took the card back, he leaned closer to her and lowered his voice. I'll be coming back to pick him up in a few hours, at the most. In case Izuku doesn't tell you, his father kicked him out, and he'll be serving time if I can do anything about it. Don't worry too much. Izuku won't be going to an orphanage or back to his father, but please, take care of him until I return." With that, he turned around and walked back to his car, cracking his knuckles. Behind him, Mitsuki seemed to be a moment away from getting her car and going after Hisashi herself, but she didn't need to worry about a thing. Percy's had that covered. Time to have a chat with Midoriya Hisashi. Son of Vulcan. The sleazy apartment building he drove up to was a stark contrast to the Bakugo's villa. Percy wondered whether he should leave Izuku with the Bakugos. But something about them doesn't feel right to him, other than the obvious brat, of course. He's learned to trust his gut over the years, and something in his gut tells him that Izuku needs more than just a nice place to live. He needs support, assistance, training, someone who can tell him that he can do it, someone who can see the drive and determination he has and help it grow into something more. Percy was happy to provide. While he did enjoy the hour-long drive to the apartment for helping him calm down and not commit a murder, Percy has grown a bit lazy after becoming a god. Instead of climbing the many flights of stairs, he simply pops up to the Midoriya family residence. Not much of a family anymore, he thought dejectedly. He didn't bother with knocking on the door this time, instead just kicking it down. Splinters of wood went flying into the house as shocked shouts came out. There was a gaggle of middle-aged men sitting at a table across the room, a poker game and beer set around them. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the drab room despite there not being a lit cigarette in sight. His gut lurched at the similarities, but he fought through it. The congregation stood as one, startled by the sudden intrusion. Putting on his best scary voice, which he's been told by many people is absolutely terrifying, he asked, "My name is Detective Jackson. Which one of you is Midoriya Hisashi?" The speed with which they all pointed a finger at one man, a carbon copy of Izuku with black hair, was astonishing. "Midoriya Hisashi, you are under arrest for the mistreatment of one Midoriya Izuku. You have the right to remain silent. The rest of you may leave," he said forcefully, giving the other players one of his signature wolf stares as he stalked forward, pulling a pair of silver handcuffs out from his jacket pocket. They almost knock each other over in their haste to get out. Still scared shitless from the entrance, and well aware of who, or rather what, he was looking at, Hisashi didn't offer much of a fight. His friends get out of the house without too much hassle, but they're gossiping the moment they're in the stairwell, wondering whether Hisashi will actually go to prison for getting rid of a quirkless shitstain. Percy isn't actually going to arrest Hisashi though, although he is thinking about sucker punching the bastard that said that. Perk. Why has much worse punishments in place for this son of Vulcan? He guided the handcuffed man to an empty seat after all of his friends left, and sat down across from him. Remaining silent, he waited for him to speak. The silence dragged on for at least 10 minutes, Hisashi still as a statue. Sweat dripped across his face despite the chilled room, his fingers clenched into a white-knuckled fist. Finally, his voice chock full of fear, Hisashi stated, "You're a god." Percy was never a fan of when people were afraid of him. However, this is a case in which he really didn't mind it. Now he does care about most mortals' boundaries. But when he had the power to sift through Izuku's memories and see what his father was really like, it would have been stupid of him not to use it. He didn't like what he saw. If Percy's being honest, it's taking everything in him to not smite the demigod in front of him. Percy feared that when he saw Izuku's plain body, it would be covered in burned scars, all courtesy of this disgusting man. Now, as he sorted through Hisashi's memories, the man is even worse than Izuku's mind had shown. He was a serial cheater, a terrible offense to the god of loyalty. Even worse, the bastard was frequently physically abusive to his wonderful wife, even leading up to her death from cancer. Percy's heart went out to Izuku. His mother had seemed like a wonderful woman and she acted almost like a more emotional version of his own mother, kind, determined, wearing her heart on her sleeve, and not afraid to fight for her son. At the very least, the one good thing that came from Hisashi was that he was a son of Vulcan. That made Izuku a Roman legacy, surprisingly. He thought he had sensed some godly blood in him, but most mortals had some these days, so he dismissed it. While Izuku's heritage would give the young god some leeway amongst his peers if he adopted him, it still filled Percy with rage that even a demigod would abandon their child for something that they couldn't control. It reminded him of his early days, before the laws were changed and gods finally allowed to parent their children, decades too late to save most of their lives. Even now, most of them still wouldn't try to be a parent. The realization reminded him of the feeling of being alone, of hoping for a parent to hold his hand, someone to teach him, someone to love him, something that was thrown away by the gods, leaving him alone in the world. It fills him with an indescribable rage, that a father would abandon his child like he was trash. All these centuries after his birth, Opal forget that Perseus was the god of many things. Heroes were often quoted as his greatest domain, and while it was not wrong, the rest were just as important to him. He was the god of the aftermath. The god of guilt and regret and suffering, the god of healing from invisible wounds, the god of storms and typhoons. The god of loyalty. The god of righteous rage. There were other gods who dabbled in rage, in future. But Perseus was the one who held these domains with a care for humanity, not for the gods. Ares would give soldiers the ability to fight endlessly with no care of what it did to them afterwards. The Moirai would care only for life and death and nothing in between. Apollo predicted the future. Aid and Oasis were the incarnations of guilt and grief and plagued humanity with their domains. Perseus was the one who gave humans rage as a scalpel instead of a hammer, who helped ease guilt and regret, who visited those who still suffered from battles fought decades ago. Overall, he was the god of what came next. The god of what happened to the living after a battle, after love, after war, after rain, after death, after hell. And he had a feeling that whatever was coming next would not be pretty for Midoriya Hisashi. You've got good senses. Percy sighed, my name is Perseus. Hisashi blanched. You know who I am. Good. You should know that the gods have their ways, son of Vulcan. To think that you would abandon your own son so readily for something he couldn't control. Perseus' rage was growing, but he was not going to kill the demigod. Other gods would have struck him down long ago. But he was the god of suffering. He may have helped others through their suffering and eased their guilt, but that didn't mean that Percy did not know how to make others suffer, how to make them feel guilt. For once, Percy really did enjoy the growing look of fear on the mortal's face. It was surprisingly relishing. He pulled a ticket out of his jacket, and waved it in front of Hisashi's face. The slip of paper formed out of stardust in front of both of their eyes. This, my friend, is a ticket to America. It leaves in 6 hours. Take your dagger, and that's it. No luggage at all. If you return to Japan or leave America before, say, 10 years, I'll kill you myself. If it was possible for Hisashi's face to get any paler, it did. The main reason that the demigod population had boomed in Japan was that the monsters hadn't followed the flame of the gods here. They were still stuck in America, for an unknown reason. Everyone else in Japan cheered and was overjoyed, but Percy knew better. He had orchestrated some of the greatest battles of the past millennia, after all. They were gearing up, letting their numbers rise back to the maximum after the massive losses they took in the early 2000s. They were part of the reason that villainy and danger were so high in America. Most of the US's most dangerous villains were actually Greek monsters. In Hisashi there was not much more than a delayed execution, and Hades wouldn't ask Percy for an explanation later either. Not to mention, the poor monsters don't have many demigods to hunt anymore. Percy guaranteed that they would take their sweet time with him. After all, they don't want to waste their generous gift, do they? Percy grinned wickedly, but there were slivers of guilt hidden in it. It was unmistakable, the god of guilt could not lie to himself on such a matter. Perhaps he truly had become a god, after he promised her not to. It's been many, many years since that, though. If Percy can really only find joy in giving retribution to those who deserve it, then let him. It's not like his life ever had much joy in it in the first place. Now get out of my sight, the young god said tonelessly. Unlocking Hisashi's handcuffs. Standing and brushing off his shoulders, he popped away, back to the street of the Bakugo household. He could faintly hear a lot of angry screaming coming from inside. And he distractedly wondered whether he really should have left Izuku with them. His rage was slowly melting away, his cold anger shifting to quiet regret at his actions, but he hoped that he could get Izuku out of the house without accidentally hurting any mortals. Shaking his head, Percy followed the pathway towards the house, simultaneously marveling at both the Bakugo's powerful sound cancelling and the sheer volume of the screams cancelling out the sound cancelling. Percy had never been a fan of people who were loud just because they could be. It reminded him too much of the gods back when he was a child. Throwing tantrums because they knew nothing could harm them. He had a feeling that he wouldn't be a fan of whoever it was screaming inside that house. He debated on just warping into the house, considering that he'd probably have to tell Izuku he was a god at some point, but eventually decided against it. In this world of unfathomable superpowers, he'll probably be put off as a megalomaniac if tries to tell a mortal that he's a god. It was better to wait until he could prove it in a way that doesn't include threatening someone with death. Percy rolled his eyes as he suddenly remembered the time his father had dragged him out for bonding time, alongside his uncles, and some police officer tried to arrest Zeus for unlawful quirk usage. It took them a lot of work to stop Zeus from smiting the poor man, mostly because Dad and Uncle Hades didn't help, instead standing off to the side and laughing their asses off. Percy didn't think he'd ever heard Hades laugh before then. Schooling his face into a neutral expression and pushing away his memories, he once again rapped on the door loudly. Surprisingly, the screaming stopped. Percy could hear loud footsteps slowly approaching the door. Suddenly, someone swung the door wide open and Percy came face to face with a miniature male Mitsuki. Well, face to torso. The kid was shorter than Izuku, and that's saying something. His eyes are positively smoldering with animosity, and he wasted no time before screaming in Percy's face. You're the fucker that brought Izuku here, aren't you? Fucking hell, I'm surprised you came back. Take the quirkless shitstain and get out of here. The blonde spat Izuku's name like it hurts him to say. Percy breathed in deeply, already regretting leaving Izuku here. He's not going to shout at an 11-year-old, no matter how much of a dirty mouth they have or how much quirkist propaganda's been drilled into their heads. Gently, he pushed past the kid, ignoring his shouts as he invited himself into the Bakugo household. He kept his hands clenched in his pockets as he stalked through the house, making his way to the back where he could sense Izuku's supernova. Slowly but surely, it was rebuilding itself. Even at its worst, Izuku's spirit's brightness had never dropped below any of the others in his domain, still dwarfing the rest, even Toshinori's borderline suicidal need to help others. Perhaps Percy shouldn't encourage him too much. A little bit of restraint might be welcome. Walking through an ajar door into a large living room, Percy was glad to find Izuku sitting on the couch. He looked like he was being consoled by Mitsuki, as a middle-aged man set the table with mouth-watering bowls of katsudon. Izuku visibly perked up when Percy entered the room. But he flinched when the other kid trails in after him, his palms sparkling and crackling. Percy tilted his head. By mortal standards, that's a very powerful power. You're back already. What about that bastard? Mitsuki asked, springing to her feet. Her eyes hold thinly veiled anger, and Percy assumes she's been wringing information out of Izuku. The full story, now that he's gotten it out of both Izuku and Hisashi, almost made him sick. The sick bastard drove Izuku out to Dagoba and fucking left him there, telling him to never come into his sight again. And that if he even thought of going to the police, well, they'd never help a quirkless kid. Percy can't blame Izuku for being scared. The man's quirk was destructive beyond belief, his control over flames non-existent, but his production almost unlimited. He'd have made a good hero, but some people just don't like to help others. Hisashi has been dealt with. Police, Percy said, giving her a self-satisfied smirk. He didn't miss how Izuku's lips parted in shock. Now, I do have a few things to say to the two of you, regarding Izuku. He began, motioning to Mitsuki and to who he assumed was Masaru. Why would you wanna talk about this fucker? The blonde brat asked, having plopped onto a couch with his feet up in the air as he completely ignored Izuku. Izuku kept glancing at him with legitimate fear in his eyes. And Percy was seriously reconsidering his, always be nice to children, rule. Percy sighed and looked towards the two parents. Unsurprisingly, they seemed ashamed yet resigned to their son's behavior. Although Mitsuki looks like she was barely restraining herself from shouting at him. Personally, Percy was stuck between both blaming and pitying them, It's obvious that they don't like the path their son was heading. But society would do everything in its power to push him down it. Although, they could do a bit more to hold him back. Walking forward, Percy began speaking. I've known quirkless people before. An understatement, most of the people he's ever been close to have been quirkless, considering they died before quirks even developed. I'm also able to adopt, have the fun. To support a child and am well aware of the problems he will face in his daily life. At the moment, it's unlikely that anyone else would be willing to adopt Izuku, sadly. If Izuku wasn't shocked before, he certainly was now. The same went for the other 3 inhabitants of the room. You mean it? You'd adopt me? The hesitation and fear mixed with hope in Izuku's voice was unmistakable. ND tugged at Percy's heartstrings harder than it should. Smiling softly, Percy states, of course, though only if you wish. Now, hold on a moment here, what if we wanted to adopt him? The brown-haired man began, looking slightly frustrated and rather suspicious of Percy. Apologies, but if Izuku didn't feel safe coming here when his father kicked him out, and if I had to convince him to stay for a few hours while I went to talk to his father, I do not believe that your household would be a good fit for him. Percy said, his voice taking on a regretful tone. Well, if the fucker wants to make a mistake like that, why would we stop him? I think my point's been proven. But, let's leave it up to Izuku, Percy rubbed his temples. The brat really was getting on his nerves and he doesn't want to lose his cool. Everyone in the room turns to look at Izuku, who looks immensely uncomfortable at the attention. I think I would want to stay with Percy-san. He managed to stutter out, his eyes flicking back towards the younger blonde every now and again. The Bakugos looked rather hurt, apart from the kid, but Percy might have manipulated the mist just a slight bit to let them accept it easier. He really had to thank Hazel for teaching well, maybe on his next trip to Elysium. Which reminded him, he really should visit soon. Or, probably not. It usually led to bad situations whenever he went. He might go just to meet up with Frank and Hazel and Jason and try to avoid the rest. Wait, Izuku first, future plans later. In any case, Izuku, let's go. And Mrs. Bakugo, here's my number. If you ever need to meet Izuku, just call. Percy handed her a slip of paper, and she nodded at him robotically. Well, Percy can't say that he's ever had a gentle hand with the mist despite Hazel's best efforts. Percy motioned for Izuku to follow him out of the building and the young boy does, staring incredulously at the suddenly silent family as they left. Now, while Percy could just pull the papers out of thin air, he should probably at least stick it in legal records that he's adopting Izuku, so that put going through legal proceedings on the top of their list of things to do. But first, an explanation was long overdue. After all, he was pretty sure Izuku was close to figuring it out on his own. Strapping himself into the car that Percy had materialized before leaving the building, Izuku was strangely quiet. And he remained quiet as Percy drove all the way back to Dagoba. It's hard to think that he met his little supernova only about 3 or 4 hours ago. Percy would probably kill for this kid at this point. Parking at a spot along the beachfront that has a good view of the ocean, Percy got out of the car with Izuku trailing behind him. They leaned on the railing high above the beach, watching the sun shine on the blue water, listening as the waves lap onto the shore. What do you know of the Roman gods, Izuku? He was a Roman legacy, so hopefully he'd have an easier time understanding it from the Roman side. Whatever the case, Perseus was worshipped the same, Greek or Roman. That had come in handy during the Second Gigantomachy. Percy had fought alongside the demigods then, when the rest of the gods could not. He doesn't have many good memories of that time. That had been the beginning of his world shattering. Not much. They were a religion practiced by the Roman Empire. But much of the traditions and even some of the gods themselves have been lost to time. Izuku's eyes are scrunched up, a face Percy was coming to realize meant he was thinking hard. But the way he's staring at Percy is still indecipherable to the god. What if I told you that the Roman gods were real, and that they still walked among us today? Percy stared out at the ocean, his mind running back to his first meeting with Mr. D, the stunned disbelief, the shock and awe and fear. Izuku stared at him, but it was with none of those things. It was almost like he expected it. So you're a god. Percy wasn't too surprised. The boy has proven himself to be smart, and he would have an easier time believing it, it's in his genes, after all. But still, he huffs out a laugh. The kid's refreshing. How'd you figure it out, kiddo? That was a confident answer. Percy kept his eyes firmly on the horizon, the waves so calm when they had been storming hours ago. He wondered if his father was watching. Maybe he should ask him for parenting advice too. Probably not. You just give off a vibe. Percy's gaze broke away from the ocean to raise an eyebrow at the kid, but he didn't falter. Just, like, you feel old. Percy blinked. I'm going to take that as a compliment, thank you. But aren't you going to ask for proof, or anything? Surprise seemed to be his primary emotion around this kid. I believe you, kind of. I mean, I was beginning to think you weren't human, maybe somehow magic or something, but a god makes sense. Sort of. A demonstration wouldn't be too bad, though. But then, why would you try to adopt me? What did you do to my dad? He didn't seem too concerned about his father's fate, just curious. Your father's fine, mostly. Whether he stays that way is entirely dependent on him. As for why I'm adopting you, Percy paused, thinking hard, you remind me of my friends when I was young. And you don't deserve the world you were given, nor the way you were treated. So I'm going to do my best to give you better. He ended his little spiel by giving Izuku's shoulder a squeeze. That was a dad move, right? In any case, Izuku looked stunned. He gaped like a fish for a few silent moments, before shaking his head frantically. Okay. You can't be real, he said in disbelief, trying to convince himself that Percy was an illusion. Percy would laugh at his disbelief, if his heart wasn't breaking at the fact he legitimately couldn't believe someone would want to care about him. Obviously, the scars of quirklessness cut deeper than he thought. Still, he smiled softly at him. I'm certainly real, Izuku. Izuku set his mouth into a thin line, determined as always. Prove it, then. His eyes are blazing with a fire that wasn't there moments ago. All right, then. Percy responded, amused and glad to see that fire once again. Brace yourself, kiddo. Percy raised his hand, and reality broke. Izuku stumbled back in shock as the world around them shattered. The ground below him fell away, crumbling to dust. So does Izuku, falling into a deep inky void with the beginnings of a terrified scream forming on his tongue. But not a moment later. He found himself standing upon thin air, miles above the sky. Feet resting on nothing, the cold wind cut into his face. He stood tall and silent in the sky, watching the clouds flow far beneath him. He could see all of Japan from up here, the curvature of Earth clearly defined, but he was having zero trouble breathing. He stared at the coast, so small he could blot it out with his thumb, and searched for the place he was standing seconds ago. It was exhilarating. Is this what it was like to fly? He wondered in awe. However, the moment passes, and suddenly he's back at Dagoba. Standing at the edge of the beach next to Percy, gulping in the sea breeze with no less excitement and amazement in him. Percy looked different now that Izuku knows he's not human. The otherworldly aspects of him, which he passed off as just a strange aura, slapped him in the face. His clothes shifted color at every moment, his eyes were deep pools of warmth and regret, his hair curled in the wind even when there was none, he smelled like the ocean itself. Apologies if that was too rough. Percy was sitting in the water, looking perfectly at home. He gestures for Izuku to join him, and Izuku stumbles over, sinking to his knees in the tides, barely noticing that he's dry even as he submerges in the ocean. No, that was awesome. Percy probably didn't expect that. If the amused look in his eyes means anything. So, you really are a god. Izuku has no clue on how to deal with the fact that gods exist, much less that one wanted to adopt him. I suppose I am. My name is Perseus, the god of heroes. And the reason that I took an interest in you, Izuku, is that I felt your dream of being a hero dying. You're the god of heroes. Izuku doesn't believe it. Yes, I am. Perseus raised an eyebrow at him. But why? Izuku can't seem to understand, why would the god of heroes take an interest in a quirkless Deku like me? Izuku asked, his voice confused and almost angry near the end, both at the world and himself. It seems like the past few hours have been nothing but his world being flipped over again and again. Perseus' eyes narrowed. the lines around them tightening as his mouth drew into a thin line. Izuku's coming to see that as his angry face, and now that he knows the man was a god, he was beginning to fear it as well. Tell me, kid, what does Deku mean? His voice was clipped and rough, but soft. His stutter returning, Izuku responded with the truth. He couldn't lie, not when looking at those deep green eyes. Well, it's an alternate reading of Izuku. It means useless. At that, Perseus' eyes blaze. His irises practically light up in vibrant greens, and he clenched his fists. Resigned to his fate, Izuku closed his eyes and prayed. To what? He didn't know, considering that a god was sitting in front of him. Kiddo. Perseus' voice was even calmer than before, but Izuku kept his head down and eyes closed. Kid, look at me. Izuku raised his face and looked at Perseus. The god's face was calm, his incomprehensible eyes no longer shining oppressively. I will never hurt you. Do you understand? Never. Izuku nodded frantically. I'm not letting this go, however. Seeing how Izuku's eyes widened, Perseus waved his hand. Not in that I'm angry at you, Izuku. Just at whoever gave you that name. He returned to staring out at the ocean, and Izuku wondered whether he should tell him who. You don't need to tell me, but you should know that you don't have to listen to them. They're as wrong as they can be. As Izuku raised his head in shock, wondering whether gods could read minds, Perseus chuckled heartily and said, Nope, you're just speaking your mind without realizing. Izuku was cert. His blush went all the way down to his bones. The two of them stayed like that for many moments. Izuku supposed that gods probably don't get too many quiet moments like this, so he sat next to him quietly, relaxing in the sand as the water lapped at his toes. Eventually though, the god stood. I am going to adopt you, Izuku. This isn't some sort of trick. Percy said, staring down at Izuku very seriously. First things first, let's go to our new house and have a long overdue conversation on why exactly you can and are going to be a hero, and then we can finalize the adoption at the station. Izuku wasn't sure that he heard him right. Come again. Perseus turned to him with a vicious glint in his eyes. All those people that thought that a quirkless person can't be a hero. You and I are going to prove them wrong. After all, you're going to be being trained by the god of heroes himself. You sure you're up to it? Izuku didn't waste any time. Yes, sir. He screamed, tears already beginning to stream down his face. None of that, sir, stuff, kid. The name's Percy, don't forget it. The young god said, a genuine and unintended smile gracing his face at the sight of the overjoyed child. It was his first such smile in decades. The house was grand. Honestly, that was pretty much the only word Percy could find to describe it. The realtor's eyes had literally bugged out when Percy offered 3 times the asking price for immediate transferal of ownership, which left both Percy and Izuku wondering whether it was his quirk or just reality finally breaking down. Percy had leaned Izuku of all the dirt and healed his burns when he had warped him, so the young boy hopefully didn't feel out of place standing behind the young god and not speaking. After all, he was still very nauseous from the warping. Instead of speaking to the realtors, Izuku quietly stared down the list of houses, muttering to himself as he privately marveled at their designs. It hadn't taken the pair long for them to decide. Near enough to the center of Musudafu and in a good neighborhood. Percy pushed through the cast iron gate, a bit squeaky, nothing that he couldn't fix with some hard work. After all, maybe he could try out life as a mortal again. It had been a century. Izuku followed after him, his head swiveling on a pivot as he tried to pick out every detail of the house. Finally alone again, having kicked out the realtor, he began mumbling aloud. Percy was just glad the boy felt comfortable around him already. After all, he'd seen the way he was treated for simply mumbling in his memories. Gothic architecture. I think. It's certainly unique. The rest of the houses in the neighborhood were modern, but the spires are reminiscent of other architectural styles too. Maybe an amalgamation. It's recently built. Probably this century. What are your thoughts, Percy? He turned to the god, not noticing the pain concealed in his gaze as he gave Izuku a weak smile. It's just a nice house, kiddo. Architecture isn't my strong point. Oh, I know a lot, I can teach you some if you want. Izuku was just glad to be able to give something back to Percy, but the slight for Wing of his brows showed him that he probably didn't want to talk about architecture, for some reason. Ah, it's fine, kiddo. Percy kept his eyes firmly away from the tall spires and unique designs adorning the building, forcing himself to think of other topics. They walked through the massive double doors together, into a strangely massive but cozy hall, already furnished with comfortable couches, bean bags, and whatever else Percy's overactive imagination deemed fit to throw in there. Izuku's eyes widened at the massive high-definition television, the fully stocked kitchen, the grand, spiral-linked staircase leading to their bedrooms, the large balconies, but what he marveled at the most during their exploration of the house, was the training room. Percy had eyed the large room with a critical gaze and deemed it fit for use. An assortment of weapon racks suddenly appearing in a corner. Percy told him that soon, this was where Izuku would learn to fight and prepare to become a hero. Izuku wanted nothing more, although some of the doubt was returning to him in moments like this. Once they had crawled through the entire house, with some rooms having seemingly no purpose, and a rondo workshop that Percy had said Izuku would probably like, they stopped to rest in the kitchen, where Percy asked whether Izuku was hungry. Lunchtime had passed a few hours ago and he didn't get to eat Auntie's katsudon, so Izuku nodded. Nodding back, Percy stood to rummage through the cupboards. Removing a variety of disparate ingredients and setting them on the counter, Percy stood in the middle of the wooden floor with his arms crossed, staring at them. He stood there for a few moments, racking his brain, before Izuku spoke up, "Do you know how to cook?" Percy's shoulders slumped, and he turned to Izuku slowly. "Maybe you want to try out a recipe you know." He diverted, eyes pleading. Izuku stifled a laugh behind his palm, which made Percy grin cheekily. "Come on, kiddo. Can you really blame me? I haven't had to cook anything in decades." "Blaming you just a bit," Izuku said, his words stifled by the hand clapped over his mouth. "How about I teach you how to make katsudon? It's one of my favorites." Percy nodded immediately, seemingly committing the information to memory, to Izuku's ongoing surprise. Izuku stood and walked over to examine the assortment of ingredients placed haphazardly on the counter. With just a glance, he could tell that Percy didn't have a clue what he was doing. Chuckling softly, he pushed away the unnecessary items and laid out what was needed for katsudon on the counter. Thankfully the kitchen already had everything he needed, so he explained the process to Percy, who was listening closely. "Preheat the oven to 400 degrees, would you?" Izuku began preparing the tonkatsu. Pulling a frying pan out of a dish rack, placing it on the stove, he poured a thin pool of oil into it, and added in the panko, gently swirling it above the flames. "I'll cut the vegetables. Could you prepare the cutlets?" Percy nodded, smiling at him softly. As Percy sliced, seasoned, and floured the cutlets, Izuku kept an eye on the panko while he sliced some onions. This was a recipe he knew by heart. After all. After a few seconds of listening to the fire crackle, Percy spoke up. "I came to you in Dagoba because I felt your dream of being a hero sputtering out." He kept his eyes on the meat as he spoke, but Izuku had no doubt he was wearing his stern face. "Tell me why." Izuku gulped, focusing on the onions in his watering eyes. Well, Dad kicked me out and he said that I couldn't do it, I should stop dreaming." Percy gripped the knife in his hand a little tighter as he made cuts in the meat. "And, well, I've always wanted to prove everyone wrong, but I can't see how I can become a hero anymore, even with you helping me. It just doesn't feel possible anymore." Izuku confided, the knife in his hand, pounding on the board as he chopped the onions, some of his anger and despair pouring into his slices. Percy put his knife down on the counter, and turned. "Izuku." His voice was soft, but firm. "Tell me why you want to be a hero." Izuku looked up from the cooking board, already speaking, having answered this question a million times. "I've always wanted to save people with a smile, just like All Might." The admiration in his voice was evident, but misplaced. Percy gave him a stern look. "None of those rehearsed answers, Izuku. All Might's legacy may be a goal you wish to attain, but why do you want to be a hero?" The bluntness made Izuku pause in his chopping. "I guess, I just want to save lives. Inspire others to be better. Make people feel safe when I'm around." Izuku looked up to see Percy staring at him thoughtfully. "Do you need a quirk for that?" The question came out of left field, but Izuku knew the answer. Yeah, you do. He sighed. Why? Percy's eyes were tight, his brows furrowed, and he kept slipping his hands into his pockets, almost as if he was searching for something. Why do you need a quirk to save someone? He repeated, and Izuku turned, sliding the golden brown panko into a bowl as he thought of an answer. Returning to his chopping board, he spoke. Without a quirk, I'd just be a liability on the field. Besides, who'd look up to me? Percy tilted his head upwards, whispering something to himself that sounded suspiciously like, therapist. What is a quirk at its most basic form, Izuku? He asked, after a moment, still staring upwards. A biological mutation that grants powers to humans. Wrong. It's a tool. And like any tool, there are substitutes. Izuku almost wanted to laugh. There was a reason support heroes didn't last long in the field. Relying on a support item made them situational. And the media didn't have a good outlook on them, pushing many out of the spotlight. And what about a hero who relies on their quirk? Would they not also be situational? Izuku really needed to stop muttering his thoughts. Yeah, it won't be a good habit for you to have once you're in the field. Percy's eyes were twinkling just a little bit, but his face was still stern. Are you going to be a hero for the media? Izuku opened his mouth to refute him, but Percy kept on speaking. No, you've already explained why you want to be a hero. So, why not prove them wrong? Where's that bravado you had at Dagoba? Percy had his hands crossed on his chest as he leaned against the counter, and his sharp eyes pinned Izuku to the floor. I don't know. It's the truth. And Percy doesn't look too surprised, so he counts it as a win. Percy took a deep breath before speaking again. You want to be like All Might. Izuku nodded. I'm afraid that you'll never be like All Might, Izuku. The harsh words shocked Izuku, and they hurt more than he thought they would, coming from Percy. But you can be just as good. No. You can be better. Izuku's mouth dropped open, at the pure confidence with which Percy spoke, and while he wanted to refute him, to tell him that Deku will never amount to anything, Percy's shimmering irises left no room for argument. True heroes, the heroes of ages past, never fought for glory. They didn't fight for others. We fought for ourselves, because we knew we wouldn't be able to sleep at night if we knew that someone was hurt, and we could have stopped it. Sometimes, I feel that our motivations were misguided, but it's too late to change the past. But what I can do is change the future, and I have a child in front of me who dreams of nothing but becoming a hero. I guarantee you, Izuku, I will do everything in my power to make sure you achieve your dream. You will be the best hero that this world has ever seen. Percy's words gave him a little insight into the god's past, but all Izuku can focus on is the incredible faith Percy had in him. He turned away, unable to face the young god's conviction. Thank you, Percy. But shouldn't you be getting the cutlets ready? Percy smiled softly, but he accepted the distraction without another word. The two moved in tandem, finishing up the katsudon together, although Percy does make a few small mistakes here and there. In the end, it did come out as a bit of a mess, but the taste was no less delectable. The pair are together in companionable silence, and though Izuku could somehow tell Percy wished to speak, he seemed to be saving it for until they were done. By the time their stomachs were full, it was barely past 7 in the evening, so Percy and Izuku settled down in the living room. Izuku sunk face-first into a bean bag while Percy sprawled across a couch. All right, kiddo. Percy yawned. We still need to go to the police station just to get you legally adopted. And then we can come back home and you can get some sleep, okay? Percy's mind was elsewhere, although he did need to get the legalities over with. Can we leave in a bit? Izuku asked, from his position face down in the beans. Percy was happy to accept, glad that the kid was fine enough with his presence that he could ask for things, however small. Let's talk a bit more, in that case. I am sure you've got your fair share of questions about me, so, here's your chance. Go ahead. Izuku rose violently from the bean bag to stare at him, stars twinkling in his eyes. What's the extent of your power? Since you're a god, do you need to be worshipped in order to survive? If you are worshipped, what does that feel like? Why are you the god of heroes, and what does that entail? Izuku was holding a notebook in his hands, seemingly manifested out of thin air. Percy elected to ignore it. Well, I don't really have many limits. I suppose there's some things other gods could do that I can't really do, like stop time, make people sleep forever or party forever, etc. As for being worshipped, well, I'm not really sure. As long as it's known that I exist, I think I'll be fine, and even then, I probably wouldn't die immediately. The Egyptian gods are still alive, after all. What was next? Right. Being worshipped isn't great, it's not my thing, but I deal with it. As for why I'm the god of heroes, well, I wasn't born a god. Izuku's eyes widened at that. I was born a son of Poseidon, god of the seas, and son of a wonderful mortal mother. However, when I was made a god, what I wanted most was for the other heroes with me to be safe, so I became their protector, the god of heroes. Izuku's question reminded Percy of that terrible day. Why couldn't he have just said no? Why? As the god of heroes, living in this second age of heroes, I just help heroes out from time to time. Jumping into a fight myself would still annoy the rest of my family, despite the revisions to the laws, so I assist in small ways. Giving a hero a burst of strength or healing their wounds from afar, stuff like that. Although, in truth, my domain of heroes isn't as much the public face of heroes but the private. I help them through trauma, ease their guilt, and do my best to heal them when they're suffering. Izuku wrote it all down on his little notebook, biting the inside of his cheek as he transcribed it. After a few moments of speculation, Izuku has another question. How? Izuku gulps, he hopes that this isn't somehow rude. How old are you? Percy blinks. If he's being honest, he doesn't really know. What year is it? He asks sheepishly. Izuku looks at him with slight incredulity, before responding, 2366. It's really been that long. It's almost September, right? My birthday just passed. I'm 373 years old. Izuku's brows furrowed and he tapped his pencil against his cheek. Happy belated birthday, but that's sort of young for a god, isn't it? You were born in 1993. Certainly before the Quirk era. Percy laughed. Yes, definitely before the Quirk era. And yeah, I am the youngest god. I was made a god for great acts of courage during the second Titanomachy. The good old days. Before everything had gone to shit for him, he meant. Well, he had no one to blame but himself. Maybe he could have had a happy life if he hadn't taken godhood. Too late now. What was the second Titanomachy? And what great acts of courage did you do? Izuku was sitting rigidly in his chair, listening with rapt attention. His small notebook alr. Edie had a page full. The hobby interested Percy, though he decided he'd ask about it later. Well, it was a war where the Titan of Time, Kronos, rose from the depths of the underworld. He tried to destroy Olympus, overthrow the gods, and enslave humanity, until a hero managed to stop him. Izuku sat up, his back ramrod straight, pencil blurring across his notebook. How could humanity not have noticed some sort of evil overlord trying to enslave us? And, well, you were that hero, weren't you? Izuku looked up just in time to see a dark look cross Percy's face. No, I wasn't. He took a deep, suffering breath, leaving Izuku with more questions than answers and continued, as to why mortals didn't notice, it's because there's a veil between our worlds, the mist. I've lifted the veil from your eyes. But other mortals won't be able to see or notice some of the things I do, or they'll see something else. So when my friends and I fought back against him, they usually wouldn't have been able to even notice. Izuku was flabbergasted. That's awesome, to think something like that exists. I wonder if this mist can be attributed as the origin of some ghost stories, and stuff. But, wait, if you fought against Kronos alongside other heroes, who were they? Were they humans? Izuku inquired, curious to the nature of Percy's companions. Well, they were like me, demigods. One mortal parent and one godly parent. Your father was one too, actually. Izuku's pencil's tip broke against the page. What? He looked up, his eyes wide and lips parted. Sorry, you didn't know. Your father was a son of the Roman god Vulcan, god of fire and smiths, and he was an engineer, wasn't he? That's why I thought that you would like the workshop. As a legacy of Vulcan, you probably have some tendency towards machinery in your blood. Percy explained, flipping an ancient friend's gold coin across his knuckles haphazardly. Izuku managed to say. So, You're saying I'm 1/4 G God. Percy chuckled. So are most mortals, kiddo. Pretty much everyone's at least 1/16th God at this point, especially in Japan. Gods have been having kids with mortals for as long as time itself. Our blood is in most mortals at this point, although very diluted. It's the best theory for the emergence of quirks. Oh. Izuku managed to squeak out. So, do you have any kids? Single quote. Wait, that was so rude. Single quote. Thankfully. Percy just laughed softly and said, nah, I don't. For some reason, that made Izuku feel warm inside. The two of them sat in comfortable silence for another few minutes before Percy spoke again. Anyways, we've spent long enough here, kiddo. To the station. Percy stood, shaking off his jacket. Izuku pushed himself off of the bean bag, still amazed at the fact that he was going to be adopted by Percy. So, car or warp? Percy's lips twitched and it was obvious he was trying not to laugh. Izuku had spent a fair few minutes trying not to vomit after the warp to the realtor's office. Car. Izuku grumbled, heat rising in his cheeks. The drive to the police station was filled with endless chatter between the pair. Percy had answered most of Izuku's questions readily, and suffice it to say, Izuku had a lot of questions. Percy didn't speak much of his part in the second Titanomachi, but the young god was a veritable treasure trove of information about the early quirk era. And even had a few snippets of knowledge to impart on even earlier histories, now lost to time. The information he had on the emergence of quirks was invaluable, though. Some of it made Izuku sick to his stomach. The emergence of quirks was not a happy or fun time, Percy's memories revealed. From genocides and human experiments that Percy skimmed over as he absent-mindedly drove through the gray and damp city, he made it seem that not a single government was innocent during the chaos of the quirk riots. He wasn't really sure he was old enough to be learning about, any of this. But Percy seemed to think so. It's not like Izuku hasn't been searching up and reading on global history and maybe a few conspiracies since he could use the computer, either. He'll trust in Percy's judgment on this. Eventually, their conversation died down as the rain picked up again. Percy huffed as it did, grumbling to himself as the sky darkened. Within mere minutes, lightning began to flash across the dark. Suddenly cloudy sky intermittently, closer and louder than it had any right to be. Percy whispered to himself sharply, "Oh, fuck off, old man." Izuku didn't think he was supposed to hear that. They didn't say anything else, instead sitting in the silence together, listening to the pitter-patter of the rain on the roof of the car and watching the city lights reflecting brilliantly on the streets as they drove past. Izuku, he had never liked silence. It was dangerous. When Kachan was quiet, when Dad was quiet, when teachers or classmates were quiet, it was nothing but the calm before the storm. Silence was a warning. With Percy, though, it was different. Silence was nothing but silence. It was just a short lull in their conversation, it held no promises of pain. No hidden tidings of any rising anger. Not even a full day of knowing each other, and Izuku was certain that Percy would never purposefully hurt him. The older man, God, was already acting like what Izuku had always wished his own father would act like. Someone who would reassure him and help him follow his dreams. Someone he could trust. Someone he could rely on. If he was being honest, Izuku still had a sliver of fear spiking through his heart that he'd wake up from this dream, back at Dagoba in the dreary, cold morning rain. Sat on a pile of trash, knowing that was all he was obliged to. Going insane and imagining a release that didn't exist. He's jolted from his irrational fears as Percy pulls into a parking lot, slowing down and parking haphazardly in a corner. Opening his door, he said, "Well, kiddo, we're here." Stepping out, he lets the rain drench him, shutting the car door quickly. Izuku unfastened his seatbelt and stepped out of the car as well, looking up at the Musudafu police station through the water already streaming down his face. It was a massive building, beige and brown and unassuming. The entrance led to a small and bustling hall, led with many clusters of hard metal seats, every single one occupied by civilians. Locking the car, Percy places a hand over Izuku's shoulder, hovering like he's not sure he should. "Okay. Technically, I think you're a missing child. So there's a possibility you'll be interrogated for a bit. Nothing too major, Just a few questions about your whereabouts, they're not gonna handcuff you or anything. He says, ruffling Izuku's hair softly instead. We'll go in, I'll talk a bit, we'll see what happens. I'm not exactly too caught up on laws or anything these days, but we'll walk out with you as legally adopted by me, alright. Izuku nods, and Percy smiled, his lips gently upturned and his eyes bright even under the cover of darkness. Izuku almost laughs, he can tell that Percy's very excited. They walk through the glass doors together. No one spares them even a glance, all too consumed in their own worries and responsibilities. A man rushes in behind them, muttering a greeting. Hell of a rainy day we've been having, 3 times today, he says, before quickly slipping into the throngs. Sighing softly and looking at the crowded room, Percy tilts his head. You know, police stations weren't this crowded back in my day. He comments quietly. Well, Izuku begins, heroes were created to deal with the rise in organized crime, but the rise of heroes and hero society led to a decline in police funding. And a rise in petty crime. Heroes can't be everywhere, constantly on call, there just aren't enough, it's too exclusive. Musudafu's police are privately funded, though. They truly manage to deal with most cases the heroes can't, he mutters quietly, leaning into Percy's hand on his shoulder as they walk through the room. Cause of that, police in other cities are pretty underworked and corrupt. But in Musudafu, they're overworked. He gestures to the crowd around them, mostly people coming in to report small crimes that the heroes can't, or don't want to, deal with. Thankfully, Mustafu's PD will probably be able to deal with everyone in the room. Eventually. Once they get through their near-constant backlog. Percy shakes his head. That's stupid. He sighed again, never thinking in the long term. Mortals are always so short-sighted, giving up what's good for them at every turn. He lamented, seemingly to himself. They stood in the crowd themselves for a few moments. Percy got a lot of odd looks, but Izuku couldn't really blame them. He had debated on telling the young god, but it was kind of funny. Everyone else had at least tried to dry themselves off when they entered. But Percy was walking around dripping wet and drenched to the bone, not noticing. Looking at the milling crowd around them, Percy leaned down to whisper in Izuku's ear, water dripping into Izuku's hair. You think anyone would mind if I pushed us up the line a bit? Curious as to what Percy would do, Izuku shook his head. Smiling, Percy straightened, before raising his hand and snapping his fingers. The sound should have been drowned out by the chatter of the crowd and the bustle of the workers all around them, but it echoed in the room, and loudly. No one other than Izuku seemed to notice it. Though, until Percy speaks to one of the receptionists all the way across the room, his voice taking on an apologetic tone. I'm afraid we're your next clients, sorry. The receptionist was already speaking to backed away quickly, returning to the front of the line without any protest. The receptionist motioned for them to come forwards, and they make their way through the room without anyone looking at them twice. It's almost like they don't exist anymore. That specific receptionist's line is completely halted, but not a person in it cares at all. Izuku won't lie, that power was absolutely terrifying. Like, incredibly terrifying. He shook his head. Percy wouldn't use it for anything bad, would he? Reaching the receptionist's desk, Izuku examined the room closer. The receptionist is behind a long, wooden desk that they shared with the others. Behind her, it seemed that the police station proper opened up, through a pair of large wooden double doors. Leaning on the table nonchalantly, Percy said, "All right, so I'm here to report a missing child that's been found." Nodding, the receptionist's gaze flicks over to Izuku, tilting her head slightly. "Name?" she asks, clearing his throat. Izuku says, "Midoriya Izuku." Clacking away at her keyboard, she looks up, her eyebrows scrunched up, and shakes her head. "I'm afraid no child under that name has been declared as missing." Why do you? Izuku's stomach sank slightly, but honestly, what did he expect? For his own father to report the kid he kicked out as missing. Besides, it's really only been a few days. And it's the middle of summer anyways. Percy groaned softly, rubbing a hand across his face. His other hand raised and waved through the air lazily, shimmering and wispy mist suddenly flowing off his skin. "Let's just skip all this, he said, pulling his hand off his face and looking the receptionist in the eyes. The receptionist's eyes go glossy for a moment, before she shakes her head rapidly. Of course. You'd like to finalize the adoption of Midoriya Izuku. You should have gone to the correct authorities, but we can finish it here, no worries. She says brightly, a stark contrast to her previous, professional and stern customer voice. Izuku blinks. He's like, 92% sure adoptions don't go through the police, but what does he know? And, did Percy have to do that again? He's not sure he likes it. He wondered if Percy would stop if he asked, or if that would be going too far, taking too much and giving too little. After all, he is a god. Izuku doesn't think he'd be too keen on having a child take away his powers. As Percy nodded his head gladly, the doors behind her slammed open and cut her off abruptly. Over the desk, Izuku could see a man in a drab trench coat stomp out, his eyes furious. Despite himself, Izuku took a step back. He was tall, well-built, and otherwise completely unremarkable, if it weren't for the anger coating his features. Wearing a beige trench coat straight out of the 80s and a fedora, he's got a hand grasping something in his coat pocket, and he's heading in a beeline straight for them. Seeming to calm down as he reaches the desk. He motioned at Percy over the desk. "You," he said, his voice calm despite his flurried exterior. Around them, Izuku can see people begin to turn and watch the conversation. "If you could join me in my office. Please," he offered, pointing a very accusatory finger at Percy. Izuku's confused. He's been confused for a few hours, though, so he took it in stride. Is this someone who knows who Percy is? Percy, for his part, hid his face behind a hand and muffled a soft sound suspiciously like laughter, before nodding rapidly. The man turned, walking to open an iced door across the room as he stepped away from the receptionist's desk. Keeping his distance, he gestured for them to follow him. Izuku noted that his eyes never left Percy. Looking at each other, Percy with bright eyes full of laughter and Izuku with a confused gaze, they followed him through long and convoluted tunnels. Who knew the police station was this big? Eventually, they came across a glossy wooden door no different from the dozens they'd already passed. The man opened it for them, backing away and waiting for them to enter. The office they entered was large and spacious, dominated by a large maple desk with documents and papers scattered across it. The walls are covered by awards, and one wall has a corkboard covered with what seemed to be active cases. It was certainly a nice place, Izuku decided. The man is important in the police station, and he's got the feel of a detective. So far, he'd only followed him because Percy was and he trusted Percy, but he had a strange feeling about the man. He was proven right when the door locked behind them, leaving them alone in the room with the man. Percy stepped in front of him, protectively without any hesitation, surprising Izuku. He could just see as the detective drew a long stick from his coat. Pointing it at the god, he commanded, "Get away from the kid." It was a stick. What the hell was even going on in Izuku's life anymore? Percy chuckled softly, the beginnings of a deep gut laugh poking through before being smashed down immediately. "I'm not gonna hurt him, I swear." Narrowing his eyes, the man continued jabbing his stick menacingly in their direction. "Forgive me if I don't exactly trust you, it's obvious you're not human, and my quirk doesn't work on monsters." Behind Percy, Izuku recoils in shock. How did he know? And how dare he call Percy a monster? His fists balled up and he prepared himself to speak, but Percy got there first. "Calm yourself, detective. Yes, I'm not human, but I think you can trust me, yeah." Shaking his head in mirth, Percy continued, "Magicians. So feisty." The detective's grip on his stick tightened, his knuckles white across the wood. Izuku can tell that whatever the hell was going on in this conversation, he's definitely not comfortable with it. He even seemed scared, almost. Tapping Percy in the small of his back, he grabbed the attention of the young god. Percy turned to look at him, his eyes wide and frantic and strangely terrified. Unsure of what to do with that reaction, Izuku stumbled forwards nonetheless. He looks kind of scared. If he knows what you are, shouldn't you? I don't know, explain." The detective's stick almost fell out of his grasp and his jaw opened for a moment, before snapping shut. Percy took a moment to compose himself, before turning back to the man with a half-ashen face. He looked contemplative for a moment, studying the other man's face. The calm expression almost seemed forced, though. As the detective rapidly moved forward, it fell just as quickly. Percy backed up, pushing Izuku further behind him until Izuku was practically sitting upon the desk, sending papers flying into the air. "I don't know what the hell you've done to this kid. But it's not gonna stand," he said suddenly, his eyes sharp and distrusting below the rim of his hat. Percy raised his palms in front of himself, in surrender. "Egyptian magician. Member of the 234th Gnome. I'm of the Greek mythos, so you have nothing to worry about," he spewed rapidly. Izuku barely understood half of it. The detective blinked, and his stick lowered for a second. Based on what Percy's said, he's beginning to think the stick's a wand, and the detective's a magician. Gods, Izuku needed some sleep. It's been far too much for one day. The detective lowers the wand, still pointed towards them but more open to conversation this time. Percy didn't move away from his position in front of Izuku, though. "Who are you? How did you know all that?" he asked, his eyes shadowed by his massive hat. "Well, first of all, my name's Perseus, and I'm a Greek god," Percy said, a laugh building in his throat. It died quickly, though, as the detective's wand dropped to the floor with a heavy thump. His gaze stayed on Percy for a split second, before he turned to run, slamming into the door before remembering it was locked. He ruffled his pockets, panicking and searching for his key. Percy's shoulders slumped, a soft sigh escaping his lips as the man opened his mouth, to call for backup, it seemed. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, spreading his arms. Still jamming the key into the door, the man turned slowly, still panicked and scared. "I swear, we have such bad reputations nowadays," Percy complained, pulling nearby armchairs towards him with a flick of his hand. He motioned for Izuku to sit in one and the young boy did, getting comfortable quickly. Despite the tense atmosphere, he could definitely fall asleep here. He's been awake for way too long. He wondered if Percy would mind if he did. The chairs were actually kind of comfortable, considering he's been sleeping on concrete for the past few days. Slowly, the detective sat down on the edge of another seat, twitchy and fearful. Percy narrowed his eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Gulping, the man nodded. "What's your name?" Percy asked after a moment of silence, reclining back in the chair. Taking a deep breath, the detective said, "Tsukauchi Naomasa, sir, I am so sorry that I insulted you, and that I ran. It was an error on my part from fear, and I hope you can forgive me." His hands are laced in the air in front of him, and his head is bowed. Percy looked at him, his eyes roving his pleading form contemplatively. "Tell me, Naomasa, what do you know of the Greek gods, that you'd be this scared?" Looking up, the man gulped again. His eyes flicked between all corners of the room and Izuku watched, morbidly entertained. He knows that Percy wouldn't hurt him. Almost as if he can tell what he's thinking, Percy's gaze landed on Izuku and he gave him a sad yet reassuring smile. The detective spoke haltingly. "Well, my lord, I used to have a friend in the 71st Gnome, who accidentally insulted a Greek god and died. As well as that, I had sensed you to be a powerful being. But I had not expected you to be," he gulped, "a god." Despite his fear, Izuku thinks that he's managed to explain pretty well, although he himself is a bit more scared of his heritage now. A Greek god killed someone for an insult. He wondered, had Percy ever done anything like that? Could he bring himself to stay with the young god if he had? Percy hummed. "Well, you're mostly correct," Tsukauchi flinched. "But I'm telling you, I am not that kind of god. Also, I'd like to know which god. Perhaps you can tell me, later." Percy tilted his head, appraising the detective. "Pret, why brave of you to take on a powerful being, all on your own, though," he paraphrased. "I haven't kept up with the gnomes in the past few years. Who are you?" Sitting up straight and proud, he replied haughtily. "I'm the director of the Japanese gnome." Izuku nods to himself. That does sound like a high-up position. "Interesting," Percy says, "and which god's path do you follow?" Some of his preview's bravado having slowly leaked back into him, Tsukauchi scoffed. "I follow the old ways," he said, pride evident in his tone. Percy laughed again suddenly, the sound filling the room for many seconds. Wiping his eyes, he says, "Ah. I remember when following the path of the gods was the new way for the Egyptian side of the family. I wonder what the Canes are up to, I should visit soon. He reminisced, staring up at the ceiling. Lazily. Izuku poked him out of his memories, he had the feeling he'd be doing that a lot. Startling, Percy sits up and says, yes. Oh, right. Help me adopt this kid. Tsukauchi blinked, returning to the facade of a normal detective instead of the fear-filled or the menacing magician. Come again. You heard me the first time, Percy said, leaning forward and placing his hands under his chin. Well, what? You are a god, right? He said, his eyes flicking between the two. They stay on Izuku for a few moments, but he can't bring himself to see he's too busy resisting the urge to yawn. Yes. My name is Perseus, and I am the god of heroes, loyalty, etc., and I would very much appreciate it if you could help me out here. The detective jolted up, and Izuku leaned back. It seems like he's going to help, that's good. Percy was pretty persuasive, anyways. He closed his eyes, giving into their heaviness and shifted to get more comfortable in the plush armchair. When he opened his eyes again, he was swaddled in blankets on a massive bed. Through bleary eyes, he recognized it as his room in his house. Groaning softly, he turned to the other side and promptly fell back asleep. Miles away, a young god walked up to Camp Half-Blood for the first time in a decade. Even longer. He didn't really know it anymore, all he knew is that the camp wasn't how he remembered it. Not at all. He wondered if Chiron missed him. The dojo was silent. It made Percy's hackles raise and put his senses on edge, strange as it was. Camp Half-Blood, that bustling disarray of buildings now crumbling on the East Coast, had never been silent. Not once, in those long, blood-stained decades he'd spent wandering those dirty paths, had it been as silent as this. Camp Half-Blood followed the flame of the gods, but it seemed that what followed was not always Camp Half-Blood. This dojo was a pale shadow of its grandeur, larger and safer perhaps, but it would never amount to much more. He sighed softly, bright mist escaping his lips as he paused at the edge of the magical border. The dojo rose from the soft earth ahead of him, down a well-weathered road into a small, insignificant valley in Japan's endless forests. Fumetsu Dojo was a small, stout building, only 2 stories high and not much wider. The wooden structure was getting on in years, though. Held together by nothing but splintered wood and fervent prayers. At least, that's what it looked like. Mortals would come sometimes, some to gawk at the establishment that had raised some of the best heroes of all time. Others to insist that their own children be taken in and trained. Fools. Ambitious and proud, but fools nonetheless. They didn't know what lay inside those hallowed walls. Neither did Percy, anymore. Once upon a time, it was happiness and joy and content and love. Another time, it had held hate and despair, shame and anger. Now, well, he'd have to find out. And the first step was seeing what it had evolved into, whilst he was away. As he tore through the mist, the pure power of Talia's border still resisting this many years later, Percy's eyes widened imperceptibly as the tall trees disappeared with a soft shimmer. The true camp was beautiful. Hiding in plain sight, nothing but a simple and unbreakable touch of glamour to camouflage them was an entire village. No. He'd hesitate to call it a village. Perhaps a town would be more apt. There were hundreds of traditional houses, stretched across the valley, no longer reserved for the children of gods, but for entire families. Generations living and dying and living within. Shops and fields for training and a shining blue lake. It was eerily familiar, almost a haphazard mix of the original 2 camps. And the offerings, Perseus could feel more than one incense burner left alight for him inside, even now. He relished the smell, sniffing the air and taking in the familiar, heart-wrenching scents, blue cookies and hot cocoa. Ozone and hay and stables, sea foam and old books. Perhaps he had neglected his duties for too long. It had been years since he'd indulged in the gifts left out for him. Tall, metallic buildings topped with bronze and gold statues dotted the paths, more than he could count, and a soft smile graced his face. Shrines, far too many to count, for gods both ancient and recent. And even more still being built, no doubt. Jason would have been proud, he decided, as he stepped through the barrier and made his way down the road. He kept a close eye on the little town as he walked. A melancholy gaze roving through the cobbled streets, tracing their dark, eerily empty paths. He was no longer a demigod. This was not his home, not anymore. But the pangs in his chest cannot be avoided. While the silent town is nothing like his memories, it's something, at least. Something that he's missed. With a soft buzz, the lights in the dojo flickered on, drawing his attention. And suddenly the bottom floor of the forgotten dojo was awash in a warm, golden glow. Percy bit back a curse. He and Chiron had not separated on the best of terms. That was an understatement. Still, it was about time that Percy did his duty. He spent long enough on his own. It was time he returned. I honestly don't know what to say. The centaur turned to him, and Percy bowed his head slightly. He may be centuries older. But he was none wiser. His old mentor's disappointed voice was still the worst punishment he could ever receive. He took a quiet sip of his tea in lieu of responding, savoring the harsh taste. Chiron definitely didn't make good tea, but Percy had missed it anyways. Chiron plopped over towards Percy, the white fur of his horse half peeking out under a pink blank. Tea with unicorn designs that he magnanimously ignored. Chiron was obviously getting ready for bed when Percy had arrived, from his half-lidded eyes and the pink curlers still in his hair. Chiron narrowed his eyes. Getting comfortable across from him. Percy was kneeled on a tatami mat in the quiet room, his teacup in his hand. "What are you even planning, Percy?" he asked suddenly, resting his head in both his hands. Rubbing his forehead with his thumbs. Percy blinked. "Nothing," he replied, but his voice was a bit more forceful than necessary. Was it really that hard to believe that he just adopted a child out of the good of his heart? He thought back, memories of some of the things he'd done in his past rising, and he quickly rescinded that silent rhetorical question. "Nothing," Chiron repeated, staring at him. His eyes were as old as ever. But, with every passing day, their indecipherable depths became easier to understand. Those ancient brown pools, so full of knowledge and sorrow, had become more and more familiar to him as time passed. He wondered what his own eyes looked like, these days. It wasn't like he put much thought into his mortal form, he just looked as he would have if he were in his late 30s. He shook his head, coming back to his senses. Chiron was still staring at him, not saying a word. "Well, yeah, nothing. What do you expect, like I'm gonna get him involved in a prophecy or something? I just made a snap decision, and it's too late to change anything." He blustered out, gripping the teacup harder than he should. The ceramic would shatter, soon. Huffing, he relaxed his hand and trained his eyes down at the ground. His eyes trained on Chiron's hooves, as he shuffled them from side to side. This wasn't exactly the reunion he'd envisioned. Short and stilted conversations. A quiet aura of judgment following him at every moment. No, this wasn't how he wanted to meet his mentor, but when had Percy ever been good at thinking things through? He hasn't even apologized for the past. He's just barged in, and expected Chiron to help him as he's always done. To Hades with it. If Percy was in Chiron's place he wouldn't have even let himself in the door. He doesn't deserve this. And he knows it. Chiron watched him panic for another moment, before letting out a short, weary breath. Well, at the very least, Percy could still tire Chiron out in less than 10 minutes. He thinks this is a new record. It isn't something he's proud of, not anymore. "Okay," Chiron says, picking up his own teacup and downing the scalding liquid in one gulp. "Okay, Percy. That's nice, I suppose. Why did you come here, then?" he asked, setting the cup back on the table. Percy can tell from his tone that he's not being accusing, that he's trying not to be angry at him, but it still hurts. Why is he here? He's here because he wanted advice on raising a child. He doesn't think that's the question Chiron wanted him to answer. Percy's here for Izuku, and because of Izuku. Without him, he doesn't think he'd have ever returned to Chiron, to Camp Half-Blood. But he's decided that he needs to help Izuku. If that means pushing through his own shame and despair, then by Zeus, he would do it. If that means apologizing to those he's wronged, he would do it, even though he should have done it years ago. Chiron. He starts, looking up to look his mentor in the eye, making up his mind. As a centaur, the man towered over him as he sat, but unlike every other immortal, he had never felt small with him. "Chiron," he says again, and he hopes that the man can feel the love, respect, reverence poured into his name. It's not enough, not for the one person who'd never left him. I'm sorry. Chiron tilts his head, and he watches him with narrowed eyes. It's a silent invitation to continue. Because two empty words, a quiet apology, means nothing to two gods with centuries of deaths trailing behind them. So he starts talking, and he doesn't stop. Quote, I shouldn't have done that whole thing with their reincarnations, and I shouldn't have fought with her, and I'm sorry about camp, and I shouldn't have turned out like this, why didn't I refuse? He breathes out, in, focusing on the actual problems instead of berating himself. It doesn't get easier. I can't, I'm sorry I ran, and I'm sorry about Reina and Jason and Annabeth, I'm sorry, He has so much more to say. So much more to apologize for, but he's cut off suddenly by a calloused hand grabbing his shoulder. Without a word, Chiron pulls him up and into a tight, suffocating hug. Percy might be surprised, and he might think he doesn't deserve it, but he still melts into the hug, relaxing as a weight is lifted off his shoulders and he can breathe again, whatever Poseidon thinks and says. Chiron was more of a father to him than he ever was. Because here is a man who knows what he's done, who knows what he's suffered, who knows for what, but Chiron doesn't hate him for it. And nor does he praise him. As the other gods do, with joyous conversations and calls to drink, for every milestone in his godhood. Chiron whispers soft, nonsensical reassurances into Hi's ears as Percy fights the urge to break down and just sob into his mentor father figure's shoulders. Unfortunately, Percy wins that fight for once, and he pulls back out of Chiron's grasp, his eyes dry but fingers twitching. He looks up, and Chiron's eyes bore into him still, but they're softer now. The skin around his eyes is crinkled as he smiles softly at him, and Percy can hear the wind sailing through pine trees on an island an ocean away. Percy, he begins, before pausing and taking a deep breath. Son, I've already forgiven you, but there isn't anything for me to forgive. Percy ushes down his tears and the words rising in his throat yet again, and breathes again, in, out, until his emotions even out. I am still sorry, Chiron. He says, bowing slightly to him. The old man, a mountain of experience next to his molehill, shakes his head, his hand still on Percy's shoulder, gripping tightly. You should be, he says after a moment, his voice suddenly sharp as H. He peers at him over his glasses with furrowed eyebrows. There are many who are ready to forgive you, and others who are not. But still, what forgiveness I can offer you pales when you have yet to apologize to those you've actually harmed. Quote, Percy pales. Chiron, they're all dead. He's not, he's apologized to him, hasn't he? Is that not enough? Chiron fixes him with an unimpressed stare. You've been to Elysium before, son. Percy breathes. Yes, he had. He had been to that golden city, in the depths of the underworld. He preferred not to go to the underworld, especially after the second gigantomachy. But he'd been to Elysium more than his fair share of times. He'd spoken to Frank and Hazel, the couple content to remain in Elysium after their first life, no rebirth for them. He'd spoken to Bianca in all of her lives, each more tragic than the last, and wiped away stubborn tears as she made her way to the Isles of Blessed. To where gods didn't follow. He'd argued with Leo and shouted at Jason. He'd fought with Clarice and cried into Beckendorf's shoulder. Once upon a time, he'd laughed with the Stalls and reminisced with the Solace Angelos. Not anymore. He'd spoken to Luke and Annabeth, at times, too. Not often. It usually devolved into a screaming match each time. Especially after his involvement in their second lives. It wasn't his right, anymore, and besides, they were probably in the Isles of Blessed, by now. He'd had to have missed their third lives, while he sulked like a petulant child in America. It may have been recovery, a period of time where he just had to be alone. But that's certainly what it felt like. So, yes, Percy's been to Elysium before, and he's failed everyone inside one way or another. The only demigods there he's still on good terms with are Frank and Hazel, maybe Jason. And even those relationships are rocky and strained. Apologizing to them is a much more daunting task than apologizing to Chiron seemed, because the love they might have once had. The friendships they'd formed, are long, long gone. Why not, though? Why couldn't he rekindle those soft, dying embers, back into the bright blaze they'd once enjoyed? Some friendships transcended death and life. If he wanted, he could. Why didn't he? Well, he knew why. He was scared. The god of loyalty, and he was scared of his once friends. Chiron's hand pulled his chin up to look him in the face, jolting him out of his thoughts. His caramel eyes looked down at him, steel in their kind gaze. Promise me you'll try, Percy. Choking back any words he might have said instead, he nodded slowly. Percy had broken too many promises in his short life. At the very least, he wouldn't break this one. He'd go, just not anytime soon. Chiron nodded at him, before clopping away, setting to acking another pot of tea in the corner of the little room. Now, tell me son, how old is this child? Mortals change drastically over their earliest years, I'm sure you remember. Chiron had a lot of good information. It was to be expected. After all, the man had to have raised hundreds of thousands of demigods by now. He hadn't really approved of him wanting to train Izuku to be a hero. Percy understood why, though he disagreed. Chiron just didn't want to see any children forced to fight in wars that weren't theirs anymore. Especially those without any power to protect them. Chiron had wondered why he hadn't just blessed the child, granted him a modicum of control over water, and went on his way. He didn't really know, actually. Maybe he already knew his little star was destined for greatness. He didn't want to interfere any more in his destiny than was necessary. Izuku was going to great things, and he knew that he didn't need a quirk to do it. Although, maybe a small blessing to keep him safe would be appreciated. Some form of self-healing, he should ask Apollo to grant it. With Izuku's permission, of course. That was for later, though. There were still things he had to do, here. Chiron had walked with him through the streets of Camp Half-Blood, ushering him through a door in the back of the dojo. It wasn't Camp Half-Blood anymore. Chiron had called it Fumetsu, a small town named for the dojo. 2,000 people resided in these dozens of intricate, paneled houses, lanterns hanging outside every house. The cobblestone paths were cool against their feet, a warm, inviting air in the town. But there wasn't a soul to be seen or a breath to be heard. It felt more like a ghost town than the unshakable sanctuary of half-bloods. Chiron didn't explain, and he didn't ask. They walked through the town, speaking quietly, and Percy hung onto every piece of advice Chiron gave him. But as they stalked the dark streets, exchanging soft words, he had a feeling that Chiron had a destination in mind. And an ulterior motive. He was proven right when the centaur stopped suddenly in a small square, the detailed cobblestone carvings curving a diamond around a massive willow tree. The leaves fluttered in the wind. A soft whoosh trailing through the streets, the only sound as Percy turned to look around him. Just a few dark houses, all as quiet as the night was. But Percy knows why he's here, or rather, who's here. Chiron placed his hand on his shoulder, and squeezed. His eyes turned down to look at him, full of grief and sadness, and a tear slipped out from behind his spectacles. Well, son, the Lord of the Wild's been missing you, no doubt. Say hello, he said softly, before turning and walking away, his hooves clicking against the stone. Just before he turned a corner, he turned back and said, "Do visit more often, Percy. I've missed you." Percy raised a hand in acceptance, not looking at him. Percy's eyes were for the gnarled and ancient tree only, as he stepped forward, his throat constricting. His palm grazes the ridged bark, and there's no spark of remembrance, no instant communication, not even a flutter of recognition. He doesn't know what he expected. Reincarnation doesn't bring memories alongside it. Still, he pulls closer slowly, knocking his forehead against the trunk of the tree, feeling the life and soul running through it. A willow tree. How apt. Willing to bend, but never to break, it fits him to the dot. Choking up, he began to speak, whispering out softly. "Hey, G-man." The willow tree did not respond. Percy slumped forwards, until he was kneeling against the tree. Stubborn tears leaking out of his eyes. Pathetic, wasn't he? No, mourning is good. This wasn't pathetic, crying didn't make him weak. Grover was one of his best and only friends. If there was anyone he could cry in front of, it was him. And he just knows that if he was here, he'd be telling him there was nothing to be ashamed of. Maybe if he repeated it enough, he'd believe it. Sniffling, he shifted until he was sat with his back to the tree, and he stared down at his hand, as a leaf fluttered down into his palm. He closed his fist, keeping the leaf safe in his palm. before shutting his eyes and getting comfortable against the hard wood. "It's been a while, G-man. It's been a while," he said, feeling for the slumbering, achingly familiar spirit in the wood. Let him sleep, he decided. His old friend would hear him anyways. So he began to speak. He spoke about everything that had happened in the century since his friend's death. He spoke, without stopping. Even as his throat turned parched and his voice turned hoarse and the sun rose, he still spoke, about everything and anything he could. All the things he couldn't speak of, wouldn't speak of to anyone else. All his worries and fears, he lay bare, and he knew that Grover could hear him. Perhaps the soul in the willow tree wouldn't understand why the god of loyalty was visiting his humble abode. Perhaps what was once Grover was long gone. Perhaps he was chasing a friendship that had been extinguished centuries ago. Percy didn't care, much. To him, it was still his best friend, and sitting there, talking about old stories, laughing softly at jokes of a dam that still ran or crying for friends long gone, he was struck with memories of a short teen who'd been by his side for everything. Who'd never disparaged his decisions, who'd never been afraid of him. The least he could do was be by his side, in his second life. So Percy talked, reminding him of their crazy adventures that had become myths and legends in this day and age. He spoke of those who'd followed him into them, the people they'd lost, the people they'd loved, and he did not stop. He spoke of his mistakes, and he did not stop. He spoke of a green-haired boy who'd lost too much, and he did not stop, not even when his eyes filled with tears and sobs racked his body. Not when the memories became too much, and his voice turned low and rough. Filled with too many emotions to name, he didn't stop. He had too much to make up for. He had too much to say, too much to apologize for. But this was a start, at least. And now that he had begun, he would not stop. Fumetsu awoke softly and quietly, but everyone knew that a god had visited in the night. Perhaps the air scented impossibly with bittersweet reunions was a sign. Maybe it was the soft breeze that carted through the streets, bringing with it a quiet, barely audible sound of the happy laughter of people who'd left Earth years ago. Maybe it was tea. The fact that many of them had woken up without a scream tearing out of their throats or tears soaking their cheeks, for the first time in too many years. Or perchance, some noticed their old injuries. Bones that never healed and ears still ringing, were aching just a little less that morning. A god had returned, but few knew he had ever left. His vigil was done, his pain pushed down and forgotten, he had a son to protect, now. There was no time for anything else. The past was the past, and nothing could change it. He'd face it with every day he continued living. He faced it with every breath he took, every tear, every drop of golden blood, until one day he could stand straight and proudly say, "This wasn't a mistake." Thanks for watching.